Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 31. I'm Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcast at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Ambassador Joseph Cella. Joseph served as the Ambassador of the United States of America to Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Tonga, and Tuvalu from October 17, 2019 to January 20th, 2021. He's the founder and principal of Pontifex Group, a consulting firm whose practice areas include public policy, public relations, crisis management, and institutional launching and growth. He is the founder of the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. Joseph, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. As mentioned in the pre-show, like our audience to really get to know a little bit about our guests, kind of what brought them along in their journey in life before they came to address such august questions of China and the influence of the Chinese Communist Party and geopolitics generally. But just give you the typical question, when you were in third grade and they asked you what you wanted to do when you grew up, did you say, I want to be ambassador to Kiribati?
Steve, thank you for the opportunity to be with you. I appreciate it. And it's rare that you have a personal side to the start of these interviews, and that makes us very special. I appreciate your leadership and all that you've done vis-a-vis China and continued to do. I grew up in Michigan. I'm the eldest of three children. Dad was a lawyer in our small town of Richmond, and was from a very young age in our front living room exposed to the grip and grin of elected officials from the city level to the federal level that would come into our home, meet my dad. He was chairman of the bank board and respected in the community, active in our Catholic church. And they would come in. We were on the main street in Richmond, and they would court him for donations, lawn signs, and so he would, direct me to, introduce yourself and look him in the eye and shake whoever in the hand, shake them in the hand, looking at them directly in the eye, and that happened. So I guess if there was a launch pad, it was there. Reading the Detroit News and Free Press every morning was my news constitution, and the Wall Street Journal News and Views right down the middle page when we received it in print format. From there. So really from grade school on, high school, went to Close Up, college, did an internship with my alma mater, Hillsdale College, called WHIP. And each successive step, Steve, was a step towards public policy, government, public service, politics. And that calling has been fulfilled, and it's been a great blessing and a joy.
Well, there's a familiar narrative of people who work in banking or finance, and it turns out people in politics want to knock on their door and ask for some support. So that's nice to know that honey actually continues to work. But actually interested in when you're growing up and going through school, did you have kind of a bent towards things international? Did you have a bent towards things politics or policy, or was that just kind of a backgrounder interest that was building along as you went through other quote unquote normal parts of life?
Yeah, great question. I would follow. I knew what domestic news was, and I knew what international news was, and would follow it with keen interest. And certainly a tracker of World War II. We had many veterans that were close to our family that lived throughout our town that we were very close to. So aware of both theaters and the combat and conflict within each. And would always engage my father in conversation on any number of these issues. And I was the one in class who would know the various geopolitical questions, whether in grade school or high school. And that, all of that served me well, and sitting at the foot of my dad and conferring about these things, asking questions. So, but it's interesting. You mentioned the inkling. So really the awareness of the South Pacific really began with World War II. I read a book of 20 years before the mast. There's another book that had a boy who sailed across the South Pacific, stopping in Fiji. And these things just added up. And who knew that these very things I was reading as a young man would figure prominently in my calling down the road. And one interesting anecdote I'll share with you: when I was at Hillsdale, after lunch, I went into the library to read the newspaper, and there was a Reuters report. This is probably about 1988, and we were all Cold Warriors at that time, and tracking all that the Soviets were doing, and who was up and who was down, and so forth. And the article spoke of a fiery Cross Reef, and it was UNESCO that had granted permission for China to build a weather monitoring station, and I think a tide monitoring station. I didn't know had anything to base why that struck me as odd, but it struck me as odd. And here we are, 30 years later plus, and that has been reclaimed now with hundreds of hectares of filled land and a 10,000 foot runway, and it's militarized now. So who knew that that past would be prologue? But
I love it when there's sort of nuggets along the way, whether it's fate or divine intervention that is sort of putting something in our path, and then there's an echo later where you look back and say, I wonder if that was by accident, and it certainly was a providential value, and sort of having these pieces put together over time. But another quick check of my memory: wasn't Detroit Free Press where the late Tony Snow had his regular column?
I believe it was the Detroit News.
There you go. See, that's why I check, because my gray matter is highly imperfect. At least I got the Detroit part right. I seem to just had an echo. I just always really admired his sort of tack on commentary, and he was one of my all-time favorite White House press spokesman, and just taken tragically early. But
Gentleman journalist.
yeah. So anyway, that's my stretch for a common tie to Michigan. But let's talk a little bit about how you ended up getting into the crosshairs for serving as an ambassador. I mean, a lot of people might think, hey, yeah, if they got that question in maybe not third grade, but in high school or college, they'd say, yeah, I wouldn't mind being an ambassador. It sounds like a cool thing. People call you Your Excellency, plenipotentiary, and all kinds of fun stuff. How about I do something like that? But it's probably not so simple. Why don't you talk a little bit about what it was like to get pulled into consideration for that, and what you go through to be an ambassador?
Sure. Rather unexpected. The 2016 election had me conferring with friends. We were going to raise some campaign support for then candidate Donald Trump in the upper Midwest, targeting Catholics in the Rust Belt states. And a core group that voted for him strongly in 2016. And it turns out one of them said, let's talk in a couple of days. He, it turns out, was having a meeting with then candidate Trump and a couple of the members of the leadership of the new campaign regime at the time. And we connected the next day, and he says, hey, I think you need to run the Catholic outreach campaign for the Trump campaign. And I said, well, I'm behind the scenes operator. I don't know. My wife was with baby at the time, baby number 6, Anthony. And, all hands are on deck in those situations. So I said, well, why don't you have somebody more prominent, and I can be the behind the scenes guy? And he said, no, I think you need to do it. So that's what happened. I accepted the offer, flew out to Trump Tower, conferred with the coalition's people, and I set forth zero budget from the office I'm speaking with you in, and a little bit of money was spent, but not much, for some campaign swag to get on TV, and that had an impact. But just quickly to conclude, election night, they were already cobbling together people to head in on the beachhead teams
Yeah.
The first wave of people that come in across the intergovernment agency and assess and confer with their counterparts and who they will be replacing. Uh, and then after the beachhead teams come the landing teams who come in on day one, inauguration day. So I was asked, can you go into the West Wing? And I was not. I just wanted him to win, and happily he did. And I just wanted to get back to life on our dirt road and our Victorian farm with our kids and our newborn Anthony. And I was told, well, be ready because you'll probably be offered an ambassadorship. And never crossed my mind. Always within me, as you talked about providence and calling and so forth early on, possibility of public service came to mind, but nothing definitive. And so this brought it to the fore, and things unfolded from there.
Very, very cool. So let's shift gears into, okay, you've got this unexpected but pretty nifty offer. How about you go serve, and you weren't shocked by the portfolio you were offered, the South Pacific? I mean, when people think about where would I serve as ambassador, there aren't that many political ambassadors, as they call them. There's a lot that are filled by the traditional foreign service. And so when you were offered this particular portfolio, were you surprised, or did you feel like, nah, this is wonderful? I've been thinking about this, and this is where I want to go.
Well, as you probably know, you are actually requested to submit several options of countries where you can go and serve. And that I did. I was given, I think, 3 days. Quickly thought about it, talked to Kristen a little bit, prayed about it. And Fiji was right there at the top of the list. Again, it was the consideration, Steve, was where can I go and lead and serve our country and have the greatest of impact? And I think you go and lead with your strengths. So my strengths, to my core, who I am and guides what I do, is my faith and my family. And Fiji is a devout Judeo-Christian rooted uh, republic and larger than average family size, and no better way to build bridges and connect with civil society than that. And that indeed is what happened in very rich and memorable ways that I'll treasure for the rest of my life.
Well, we could probably have all the rest of the conversation just about the sights and sounds and the people that you met. I'm sure it was
Sure.
an immense, colorful, in every sense of the word, kind of experience. I have some friends who have served in different capacities in different parts of the Pacific, and every one of them have just had tremendous personal experiences about what it was like, unlike anywhere else. I would assert, you would know. But let's talk a little bit about some of the geopolitics. This is the China Desk, however, of course, so we're going to have a real interest in what did you find and what did you feel like you were working with when it came to advocating for the United States. Some of our audience knows from past conversations where we talk about the malign influences of the Chinese Communist Party. We do have a point of view about the nature of the Communist Party, but we're not kind of imposing what our ideology or other kinds of judgments need to be. Of course, they're right, though. And when we think of this part of the world, especially the South Pacific, I don't know that everyone in the audience would have a feel for who are all the players. Obviously, World War II had a big impact on American engagement in the South Pacific, but also a number of other nations. I mean, Japan has had an impact in the South Pacific. Our allies that are in the region otherwise have an impact with Australia, New Zealand. But talk a little bit about what the kind of neighborhood influences were outside of just the countries themselves that you were blessed to serve.
Yeah, my diet of anything China, Indo-Pacific certainly did scale when this became a possibility, but always had a steady diet of it over the years. But on final approach to my confirmation and heading out to post, two significant things happened. Two island nations flipped their recognition from Taipei to Beijing. Those are the nations of Vanuatu and Solomon Islands. Just about 3 months before I took the oath. So again, those are serious things. They're on the hunt for those beachheads, if you will, to conduct malign influence and run around with the diplomatic checkbook to just further their chess pieces, so to speak, in the Indo-Pacific theater, and always have to cast a wary eye on what that involves.
Can
I,
you unpack that a little
yeah,
bit? Because a lot of people know that there's dollar diplomacy of sorts, but it's really renminbi diplomacy, going out where China is using money or the promise of profits or infrastructure investment or whatever it might be. But you ran into this news on the inbound trip to get to post, but while you were there too, what can you tell us with some degree of color about how is the CCP engaging in this kind of influence campaign in that part of the world?
sure. I can just give you a quick anecdote of
Yeah.
my day one arrival. Day one arrival from the airport, driving by the U.S. Embassy for the first time. I see this towering red and white radio antenna right next door. Shouldn't be there, in my view, and immediately thought, "What's on that thing?" And I knew that China had a very strong relationship with the then regime of the prime minister, who's no longer prime minister. The second thing I saw was a 400-foot white Chinese ship with four massive satellite arrays on its deck, missile tracking ship, satellite tracking ship, surveillance ship at the end of the day. Arriving at the residence, I look out, and straight ahead of it was this high rise, almost eye level, but downtown Fiji. And I asked the driver what that was. He says, "Sir, that's a Chinese project that's gone bad, but again, a textbook Overwatch site, I think, for our residence and that of my Five Eye colleague from New Zealand, who was just next door." That was day one, and then it manifested itself in any number of ways where it was well publicly known that the staff of the Beijing CCP, PRC embassy would lurk in the bushes and take photos of people. They would have a 9 p.m. curfew. There were a couple of incidents later in my time where Taiwan National Day happened, and staff, defense attachés, were ordered to crash it and grab the flag off the cake, the Taiwanese flag off the cake. So they tried to make an entrance. They failed. They were pushed back. My former counterpart, Sean Bowe, ordered them back in, and fists flew. Glasses were broken. People were sent to the hospital, and they never got through. But that gives you the idea of just sort of the raw wolf warrior diplomacy with the latter of those instances of what's afoot with the PRC and the CCP.
I was going to say that sounded wolf warrior before people were talking about wolf warriors. So they're perfecting their craft out there in the diplomatic shores in the South Pacific.
Sean Bowe is now the liaison to all of the Pacific Islands, which and you see his work manifest. I've been writing since my return of the various threats, ranging from the importance of extending COFA funding after the compacts were renewed, and that we should be very wary. We have to scale our game and our engagements in that region because they were on the hunt. Well, in just recent weeks, you probably know, it was last month that, not surprising, in a way surprising, more disappointing than anything, that the one of the nations I was accredited to, Nauru, flipped its recognition to Beijing from Taipei.
Well, so we know that there is no country too small for Beijing to try to lure, snatch control. And we know that this geography mattered to China too.
Truly.
Talk a little bit about why this geography matters to the United States and to our especially priority allies of Japan, Australia, New Zealand, in terms of our coalition engagements in the Pacific.
Not too far away from Kiribati, which flipped also ahead of my arrival to Beijing, um, uh, is and not too far from Nauru is the Ronald Reagan Missile Defense Battery at the Kwajalein Atoll, and Indo-Pacific Command is not too far. So the further China plants their flags with diplomatic recognition of these countries that many of them have deep water ports or ports deep enough where they could advance their naval assets and runways long enough where they could land their PLAFS assets. That upsets the I think the defense scheme and the scenarios. There are several island chains that emanate out from the South China Sea, and this is really the outer reaches of it. And you really never want them to get behind you when you're out front, so to speak, in the scenario where there is a hot war. God forbid, diplomacy first and always. But you live by the maxim of si vis pacem para bellum. If you seek peace, prepare for war. And we always have to keep a very sharp eye on this. And I think that there are many opportunities that are cost effective and diplomatic engagements that could have been engaged and secured, but we are where we are. But I think it is. I just recently wrote about this of the imperative to scale this. Admiral Mike Studeman gave a great talk, magnum opus talk. He's now retired, former commander of ONI, about a year ago, where he stated that the China problem is more gargantuan than it can be appreciated or understood. Very sobering.
Well, I have to agree with that magnitude of an assessment. And if only our effort to understand and respond was matching the sort of diagnosis. We've been, I think, okay and getting better on diagnosis. Prescription, I think, is where we have a really, really hard time. Talk a little bit about what it was like working with allies in terms of your day-to-day work. I know from my years past that there was, in some ways, a perceived division of labor among the United States, Australia, New Zealand for kind of taking the lead on security and economic collaboration on policy with different parts of the Pacific. And there were clear security roles, but when it came to who's recognizing whom, there's tremendous commercial business that's flowing through that part of the world too. Just talk a little bit about what the realities were of working with those key allies.
It was a greatest of memories that I had working with our Five Eyes partners. I'm not going to name names here, but one of them had said in my first consultation phone call I had, said, it's so important that you're here and that you finally got here. And again, due to the confirmation politics, I had no hold on me, but the runway was extended. It was about a 2-year wait between my predecessor and my arrival. So it was really an opportunity to assess the operations of the embassy, tighten things up, and then scale and just execute the 100-day plan that I had devised, did a SWOT analysis, and then set forth. But it was a beautiful engagement. Steve, really the pandemic allowed a pivot moment to link arms with them and go about it met with them, talk with them, to go about it very disciplined, very intentional, very high visible, with high frequency public diplomacy engagements where we talk about our common principles, rules-based order, transparency, and stability and security, and maintaining the peace of in the Indo-Pacific that our forebears fought and bled for 75 years ago, which we also feted with them with great joy. But it was a very special engagement. It's a little bit of a dance because that is their territorial prerogative. Their navies are closer there than ours and can get across the ocean more quickly than ours, and prioritization. But so it can be a little bit of a dance. I think there's some friendly competition there, but we really, again, we left with great accomplishments and a great committee. I'm still in regular contact with all of them, and they're still in their career diplomatic posts with their respective countries. But it was a
Excellent.
great blessing.
Well, with regard to the China challenge and sort of assessment of who was doing what to whom and how we needed to respond, did you feel like you were having to bring allies along, or did you feel like the allies were most of the way there and this was really just waiting to see where will the United States lead and we want a partner we can rely upon?
They were very cooperative. I think that um, uh, I came in with great focus and uh, uh, a sprint pace. They had been there a while. So when I set up, it was a bit of catch up. We were blessed to have many more assets in terms of budgetary and staff and so forth. So we can do a lot more and have an impact. I mean, Suva, the post at Suva is essentially a regional embassy. We're popping up embassies elsewhere now that tent stakes were once pulled up from. But it was really, I think, a textbook engagement of the Five Eyes relationship that was born during World War II. And I know that we had left a very fertile bed for our successors to come in and continue the important work that the importance of which has certainly scaled since we left.
So sometimes during your time of service, not because of your time of service, I should emphasize, there was this narrative of the United States kind of pulling back, and then when it came, so there might be some tinge of isolationism in the commentary, or ceding some of the major regions of the world to other influences like China. But there was also a little bit of a tinge of the argument that there might be some cranky people in Washington, like Crazy Yates or other kinds of people, are saying that this China problem is big and we need to get everyone focused on the China problem. What I'm deducing from your observations, but correct me where I'm wrong, is that is somewhat at odds with what your life experience representing the United States in that part of the world during that time would reflect. The United States government from multiple agencies was engaged, was collaborating on a daily basis with allies that welcomed the cooperation. There wasn't a sense of them being pushed one way unwillingly or another. And when you had need of support, my observation from the outside was that there never had been a time when people at senior levels of the White House, State Department, or other key agencies had paid as much attention to Oceania as they did during those years. It was kind of a high watermark. I mean, you really have to go back to terrible times of war to have had more high level engagement, and we don't want that to happen. But am I right basically in sort of setting the scene for how your experience kind of countered the narrative that went through most of our media and commentariat at the time?
Yeah, I mean, so many things to share with you there. But really, with President Trump's leadership, Secretary Pompeo, Dr. Miles Yu, who's his top China advisor, uh, uh, really, it was a message was sent early on that this was the next threat, the next theater of tensions, and everything that needed to be done in the infrastructure of the U.S. government was being done as quickly as it could, as best as it could. I mean, it does take time to just scale and get the resources out. I mean, you even look in the Biden administration, and the COFA renewals just happened recently, and the funding still isn't happening. So, but very positive. We had the resources we needed. Again, I think that I would always say that a little bit of love and attention goes a long way. The public diplomacy was really priceless, and then the others, whether grants or trade agreements that we signed with Bob Lighthizer or Secretary Kroc, was very impactful. And it was really, I think, just exemplary leadership by the United States of America. And it really needs to scale from there. You run into sort of the missed layups that shouldn't have happened, but those will always be there. They're certainly frustrating, but I think it points to a very nexus where we're at in history to have our game face on right now.
So, what would you sort of say are the nuts and bolts of a successful strategy to kind of take where you had left things in your experience and build toward a good, sustainable glide path into the future, where America is present? I mean, in the Biden administration's lingo, they'd say America is back, but people would feel in the region that America is committed, and for the right reasons. I guess this is sort of the first of a couple of questions I have about how the people of this region perceive the elephants that come into their room. I mean, the United States shows up in some of these areas, and it's going to be an elephant in any country. It's going to be a gargantuan elephant in some of these jurisdictions. And you've got the sort of elephant butting heads with the dragon, so to speak. And so I want to get a feel for how the people perceive this. You got the little dragon of Taiwan that had diplomatic relations and I'm sure economic and cultural interaction with a lot of these people. And so there must be some vestige of how these folks perceive what we're doing. But I guess back to my question, to edit myself back to something you can actually respond to. But what are the building blocks that would make the United States successful in the absence of sending Ambassador Cella back over and over and over? What do we do programmatically?
Sure.
What kinds of investments are the right investments? What kind of partnerships need to be built up? What kinds of technologies or products or industries need to be emphasized? Any of that.
Yeah, a great question. I guess starting at the locus of the embassy itself, I think that the embassy in Suva could probably stand to have a headquarter or junior headquarter for USAID, through which much of our aid goes to these countries. I think it's there, and that should happen, I think, in short order. So I think these are I think easy opportunities that have worked time immemorial. I think the Peace Corps is key. We've had people there, we've pulled them out, but I think that some waivers ought to be given where some sensitivities and awareness to medevac arrangements, should they be needed, should be, I think, empowered to just facilitate those when they need, so that they can do their good work in the remotest of these nations, whether it's Nauru or Kiribati, with we still blessedly have relations with, though they've tipped to Beijing now. And I would say the civic action teams that my great former ambassadorial colleague John Hennessy Nyland did to great effect in Palau, one of the compact states. And there, months at a time, you have multi-branch service members coming in, building things, training people how to do them, and you have leave behinds, whether it's schools or hospitals, but also the technical skills. So I think those are very easy means, I think, to I think zero in on in the coming years and scale. I think that also we could be more. One idea with respect to Tuvalu, who is the next one to watch. I think our Seabees carved that runway there in Funafuti, where we had B-25 Mitchell bombers flying off doing missions, and well built, but basically built. And to think, after nearly 80 years, Steve, there's no drainage. And it's a very low-lying atoll, and it would take you and me and some tiling and a tiling machine to run that water off the perimeter of the runway and out away from it. And too often it closes down. But again, that is, and that impacts the flow of goods and transport of people to and from medically and otherwise, tourism to other nations. So something like that, again, relatively low cost, easily done, wins the hearts and minds. And that's just for starters, Steve, in terms of options that could be executed.
Well, certainly things that a reasonable person of any political persuasion ought to be able to understand and pick up and agree are worth it. I mean, I think you've made the point. I certainly agree with it. A little bit of investment can go a long way in this part of the world, and showing up goes a long way. So having some officials of sufficient rank show up from time to time, mentioned by the president, the vice president, and other key leaders from time to time, getting senior members of Congress to show up and share some of the interaction, show respect, cooperate with allies. All these little things could go a long way, and don't, in the grand scheme of things, cost that much money. But it can affect what our deterrence posture is, what our coalition of the willing is, if things happen to go a different way. So I certainly think it's worthwhile. But Joseph, if you don't mind, let's pivot a little bit in the conversation about things China writ large, and talk about the role of your faith in diplomacy. And when I mentioned in the pre-show, I spent a lot of my life reading and studying. I'm an imperfect scholar in this subject matter, but it should come as a shock to no one that it was Catholic missionaries that were among the earliest to enter China as we call it now. It was those dynasties had different names that were not China when those priests showed up. But talk a little bit about the role your faith has played in how you see things in the China policy community. If you need a starting point, we could begin with what's happened with Hong Kong. Cardinal Zen is someone that I consider to be one of the most interesting and loving people I've ever met in person.
Yes.
Small in stature, big in heart, big in spirit, and he has not met with success that he would consider it, I would assume, and as I would assess it in terms of what he cares about. How does that play a role in your thoughts, and what our collective thoughts ought to be about how to understand China and the influence of the CCP and how to try to engage it?
Reverting back to one of my earlier thoughts of just how to have an impact and building bridges, again, who I am and all that I do is really girded on the cornerstones of my faith and my family. The missionaries that you could say brought the island nations into Christendom, you could say, in the 19th century. Catholic Father Peter Chanel was actually martyred a few hundred miles northeast of Fiji in the mid 1800s. But really exemplars of serving in the Lord's vineyard in some places that were unvisited by the Lord in any way, shape, or form. But heroic men, heroic women. You had mentioned the Chinese missionaries, Matteo Ricci. I was just talking to a friend about that today on a separate matter, a Jesuit, and also St. Francis Xavier, another Jesuit. But I can't stress enough how who we are as a people, as Americans, and in the West. We're Judeo-Christian tradition, Judeo-Christian rooted, and there is great comity there and a bond with the people of the island nations. They are minded like us, and I think faith is really underused as a diplomatic tool. There are some sensitivities in the administrative state where you can't do this; it's all secular. But you can do it, and I think more diplomats should do it carefully, prudently, and talking to all people of faith as well. And I think that they appreciate that, and I did that with great vigor. Whether it was our Mormon brothers and sisters, or our brothers and sisters in the Islamic faith, or any number of the Christian denominations. It was just very fruit bearing. And I would say that we bring a unique authenticity in the West to the people of the island nations that I'll say others really don't. I think we have it in our hearts, we have it in our minds, and we have it in our souls. And I think that the impact of faith and leading very publicly with it, prudently, the importance of that can't be overstated.
Well, I agree completely. And I think it's one of the core reasons why these conversations really, really matter. And I think to kind of build on the point that you were making, I think one of the beauties of the outlier miracle that the American experiment is that we can actually have deep roots in family, faith, and individual experience that don't come from the state, that exist outside of the state, but still have no less love of country.
Truly.
And when we come across counterparts, say from the People's Republic of China, the contrast couldn't be bigger or more significant, where they could never show up at post and emphasize things that were values and experiences of great value that were derived outside of, and maybe even more important to you individually than is the state. And without presuming too much about an area of the world you lived, but it, I think, resembles some places I've been to. Those places that have deep roots respecting family and tradition, they know what we're talking about when they say, look, we don't love our country any less, but there's these other things that are bigger. And in a way, it makes it clearer to them that we haven't come to bludgeon them with a government sort of sledgehammer to do something.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis called those the permanent things, and they were beautifully on display. I can share with you one of our first getaways at this modest beach uh, uh, resort, small place, mom and pop run. We got out of the van. I was carrying our baby Josepha, as his Fijian name goes, and I walked out, and I turned, and there's this beautiful Fijian woman, just like motherly smile on her face, and coming with him with her arms wide open. And she took him as though he was her own, and he went to her as though she was his own. And that repeated itself, Steve, time and time again. We would stay after Mass at Sacred Heart Cathedral on Sundays, and visit with the locals as though they were, again, family, and have tea and cookies with them. But it is something that it is ingrained into us as a people, and it really needs to be used as a force for good that it is. And I can say that when this was done, you not only the faith, just the engagement with the Five Eyes partners, but particularly in the faith, our Chinese counterparts really retreated. They essentially went dark. They couldn't keep up. They would do things episodically, but we really, proud to say, let the light shine for Five Eyes in the West, and Judeo-Christian truths in a way that they can't.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, I want to thank you for sharing your experience. So much of it, it was really uplifting as much as it was enlightening. Just grateful for you sharing some of that. For people that want to follow you, your commentary, your work, are there any places you'd like them to go to follow the things you have to say?
Sure. So at the beginning of our conversation, I shared with you that I've always writing on things involving the China problem threat in the Indo-Pacific. But of recently, I've engaged about a year ago with my former ambassadorial colleague, Peter Hoekstra, on the subnational threat of China in the States. And we're engaged here in Michigan. So if there's anything that for people to follow along, it would be a Twitter page that we have under the aegis of the Michigan-China Economic and Security Review Group. It's simply the @ MCESRG. and our work is on display there of tracking and targeting the China problem and threat that is evident in Michigan. We've been successful, but the fight continues.
Well, that sounds like a topic for a future episode, if there ever was one. Would love to talk. We're very, very interested in what's happening in the States. But for now, we're going to have to leave it there. For our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. Thank you very much for joining, and a special thank you to Ambassador Joseph Cella for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.